The bright sun shone golden on the fields and the olives. It shone also on the huddled corpses of the Frenchmen, heaped around the bridge where we had expected to find them. Most of them had been stripped of their boots and outer garments by the Moors, and lay there in their underclothes in every attitude, grotesque and stinking, shriveled by 2 days' hot sun. With ghoulish intensity, Roth probed among the bodies, urging me to do the same. We found no trace of mutilation, but after 10 minutes of this grisly business, I was violently sick and told Roth I could not go on. My legs would hardly carry me back to La Marañosa, where I drank nearly half a bottle of Roth's brandy before I began to recover. If this is the sort of thing I have to do to prove myself a man, I thought, I think I'll stay a mouse. Roth was quite unmoved. That's Peter Kemp in his book, Mine Were of Trouble. And that's just one of his many gruesome experiences during the Spanish Civil War. War, it's ugly. I'm Daniel Welsh. This is Spain to Go, the best podcast in the entire multiverse for all things Spain. And today we're going to talk about the other side of the Spanish Civil War. Previous episode 37, we did George Orwell and Homage to Catalonia. Today we have an entirely different story. Remember that episode of Seinfeld where Elaine meets a group of guys who are exactly like George, Jerry, and Kramer, except at the same time they're polar opposites? The episode is called The Bizarro Jerry, and it's based on a premise from the Superman comics in which a parallel version of Superman is a villain on a cube-shaped planet called Hatrai. That's Earth spelled backwards, if you're keeping track. Elaine's bizarro friends on Seinfeld are nice people. They do good things, they read books, they're reliable, and they don't apparently get into wacky adventures every week, or engage in the usual Seinfeldian antisocial behavior the series is famous for. In the beginning, she enjoys their company, but eventually a conflicted Elaine has to choose between the two groups. The dull but basically decent group of bizarro friends on the one hand, and their polar opposites, the gang of zany narcissists on the other. Great way to start an article about the Spanish Civil War, huh? Well, it's for a reason. A couple of years ago, I saw something on Twitter, something that suggested that if I wanted to have a standard narrative completely turned on its head, I should read Mine Were of Trouble by Peter Kemp. I bought the book on Kindle, not really knowing what it was going to be about. Turns out, it's another Spanish Civil War book. Peter Kemp, in fact, is the Bizarro George of the Spanish Civil War. Regular George, of course, is George Orwell, whose book Homage to Catalonia is pretty much the canonical narrative for most of the English-speaking world. Peter Kemp is Orwell's opposite. Graduating from university and coming to Spain in late 1936, he falls in with a ragtag crew of tough but kind-hearted men, mostly kind-hearted men, battling an evil enemy for an unquestionably good cause, all by joining the national side and fighting against the socialist, communist, and anarchist Reds. Yes, Peter Kemp is the right-wing answer to George Orwell. Kicked out of the Cambridge University Conservative Association for being too conservative, at least according to his version, he joins up with a group called the Requetés on graduation in order to fight against the forces of chaos and have a little adventure before he's tied down to a boring job as a barrister for the rest of his life. He is, in other words, a private university kid taking a gap year, one that just happens to include some very bloody trench warfare. And while Orwell's stint in Spain lasts just a few months, Kemp ends up fighting for the national cause for most of the war. First in the Requetés and then in the Spanish Legion, one of Spain's toughest fighting forces. In the end, he's wounded several times and spends the final months of the conflict back in England, only to return to Spain when it's all over to meet Franco personally. He's a bit starstruck by the master of Spain, as well as by other important nationalist figures, the Duke of Alba, General Millán Astray, and others. The kind of people who many Spaniards today would rather forget. Let me apologize now. I'm trying to speak English and also correctly pronounce Spanish names throughout this, and I'm bound to fail at certain times. So my apologies. There are some complicated names in this thing, and my accent is far from perfect. Anyway, welcome to Bizarro World, Spain, 1936. I would like to express here the perhaps unpopular opinion that Memoir of Trouble is a better book than Homage to Catalonia, mainly because Kemp saw a lot more action than Orwell. This isn't a political book. In fact, Kemp talks politics quite a bit less than Orwell. I've read the whole thing twice now, and what I get is that he's a traditionalist who's against communism and who doesn't appreciate the burning of churches and killing of priests. In describing his motivations for joining the national side, Kemp says that the political motive was important only in helping him choose which side to fight on. But then he adds, "But there's another thing, just as important. If you've read the news reports published at the beginning of this war, before the imposition of censorship, you'll know that there were appalling scenes of mob violence throughout government territory, wherever the Reds took control. Priests and nuns were shot simply because they were priests or nuns. Ordinary people murdered just because they had a little money or property. It is to fight against that sort of thing that I am going to Spain." That said, he doesn't like the politics of the Phalange. He laments the nationalists' moves in the direction of totalitarianism as the war drags on, and he doesn't seem to be a fan of Hitler. Although I should mention he's writing well after World War II ends. Memoir of Trouble was published in 1957, when apology for Hitler would have been a taboo even among old-school conservatives. Also, at the time of writing, he says that he looks back on his younger self as being embarrassingly naive. At least, he tells a friend on the day of his departure, the experience is bound to be useful, and anyway, I've nothing to lose. Nothing to lose indeed. Kemp doesn't seem to be considering that he might be killed when he joins up. In fact, he thinks, like many people did at the time, that the Spanish Civil War was going to last just a few months. He's worried it'll all be over by the time he makes it to Spain. He's wrong. As the quote at the beginning of this podcast suggests, he sees plenty of violence. Something I didn't know about the Spanish Civil War is that at the beginning there were several factions on the nationalist side, and the fascists, the Phalange, won out only through political maneuvering and infighting. At the beginning of the war, the Phalange was a small, basically irrelevant fringe party, and Franco wasn't a part of it. But in the course of the conflict, the two other generals who had organized the coup, Sanjurjo and Mola, died separately in plane crashes. 1930s aviation was not what it is today. Also early in the war, the founder of the Falange, José Antonio Primo de Ribera, was executed in prison in Alicante. Franco had the new leader of the Falange arrested and took over as the leader of the nationalist side of the war effort, making him the central bad guy in the Civil War narrative. But things could easily have gone in another direction, several other directions, in fact. According to Kemp, quote, "Of the army officers I knew, either personally or by repute, scarcely any had Falangist sympathies. Some were monarchists, but the majority preferred to leave that sort of thing to the politicians and get on with winning the war." Unquote. At the same time, over on the left, the anarchists, socialists, and bourgeois democracy types were being pushed out of the Republican war effort by the communists, with the aid of Stalin and the Soviet Union. That's a large part of what happens in Orwell's book. Thus, the good guy, bad guy narrative takes yet another hit. Far from being a simple fight of democracy versus fascism, it turns out there were lots of different people with lots of different motivations, many of them pretty shady, on both sides of the war. Kemp describes groups like the Requetés and the Carlists joining the national uprising against the government in order to protect Spanish traditions and the Catholic Church. Quote, "Boys of 15 and old men of 70 alike rose to defend la fe and la tradición, following in the steps of their ancestors, who had fought under Zumalacárregui in the last century." Unquote. I was dreading having to pronounce this name. Zumalacárregui was apparently a leader of the Carlists, who were a faction in a war, the Guerras Carlistas, that took place in the 1830s. It was a war of succession, meaning who was to be the next king of Spain. Other than that, I know very little about it. Anyway, this defending the church thing seemed a bit dubious to me when I first read it, but then I thought back through the list of Spanish people I'd known, and I thought of a couple of friends from La Mancha years ago who were very Catholic and sympathetic with the anti-communist cause because of the burning churches thing. I didn't think of them as being fascist sympathizers, just small-town folk. I never asked, come to think of it. In my mind, they were just nice people who were super excited about Catholicism and had some, in my opinion, rather old-fashioned ideas. Which brings us to the Red Terror in Spain. Anthony Beevor, in The Battle for Spain, which you should read if you're into this kind of thing, says that between 6,000 and 7,000 priests and nuns were killed during the war, especially during the first few months, when there was an outbreak of mob violence against the church and the bourgeoisie in Republican territory. The official number I see almost everywhere is the very precise figure of 6,832 people, including priests, nuns, a few bishops, and other clergy. In his book, Orwell says that churches in Catalonia were burnt as a matter of course, but laments the headline "Reds Crucify Nuns" in the Daily Mail as being bad journalism. Kemp mentions at least one village allegedly crucifying their priest, but the historical, non-memoir studies I've read don't mention crucifixions specifically. Anyway, why all this anger? Well, the Catholic Church had a huge influence in Spain in the decades and centuries leading up to the war. They'd alienated quite a few working-class people in that time, with the idea that the meek shall inherit the earth, which many considered to be a scam that benefited the rich at the expense of the meek. Anarchists thought the Catholic Church to be nothing more than the psyops branch of the state, the psychological operations of the state, through religion. Marx would have agreed religion is the opiate of the masses. There was a lot of anti-clerical feeling among the left. So when the state started to collapse, people tried to get even with those in power wherever they found them. And it wasn't just the church that was a target of violence. There were scores of all kinds to settle. While one of Franco's press attachés said that Spain would have to cleanse the country of the proletariat, socialist members of the Republican government wanted to get rid of the bourgeoisie. In many places, people who owned land, factories, or even shops were shot for belonging to the hated bourgeois class. Socialists might stage a show trial to prove their victims' fascist sympathies. Anarchists, on the other hand, preferred shooting people on the spot, to imprisoning them or putting them on trial. What kind of libertarian group is going to set up a prison, after all? If they became prison guards, they'd be no better than the state apparatus they hated. So they ended up as executioners instead. In other words, those were tough times for a lot of people. There were atrocities committed by both sides, and in the end, far more by the nationalists than by the Reds. In part, of course, this was because the fascist government kept their witch hunt going for a couple of decades after the war had ended. Says Kemp, quote, "Certainly the execution of prisoners was one of the ugliest aspects of the Civil War, and both sides were guilty of it in the early months. There were two main reasons for this. First, the belief, firmly held by each side, that the others were traitors to their country and enemies of humanity who fully deserved death. Secondly, the fear of each side that unless they exterminated their adversaries, these would rise again and destroy them." Unquote. One of the more emotional scenes in the book has Kemp overseeing the execution of an Irish prisoner. Kemp's tried to intervene on the man's behalf, but orders are orders, and the commander wants prisoners to be shot. A lot of people around him disagree with this policy, but there's nothing to be done. Discipline in the Legion was quite different than in Orwell's militia. Kemp knows he'll be shot himself if he disobeys. Here are a few more quotes from Mine Were of Trouble to give you an idea, but you should really read the whole book if you're interested in the topic. Peter Kemp describes the evil fascists he's fighting alongside. Quote, "The Phalange Company stationed in the village were Canary Islanders. They were a gay and feckless lot who spent all their money in the taverns and most of their time singing and playing mouth organs, at which they were remarkably skillful. They seemed to regard the war as a joke and anything military as utterly ridiculous. We became very friendly with them, joining at their parties in the evenings and carousing happily together." Unquote. Here's one on his brief stint on the Madrid front, fighting house to house in the Carabanchel neighborhood in the south of the city. Quote, "Our only line of communications with company headquarters and the rear was the tunnel of sandbags. Through this had to come all our food, water, ammunition, and supplies. Through this we must evacuate our wounded. It could only be done at night, which meant that a wounded man might die before he could receive proper attention, for we had no doctor. Water was so scarce that there was no question of washing or even cleaning our teeth. In a few days we were all infested with lice. Our food, which consisted chiefly of mule steaks and dried codfish, was cooked at company headquarters." Unquote. Here's Kemp shooting at the Reds during the Battle of Jarama, one of the larger Civil War battles immortalized in the song Jarama Valley by Woody Guthrie. Quote, "My throat was dry, my face hot, and my hands shaking as I feverishly loaded and fired my rifle. With a great effort, I pulled myself together and began to fire more slowly, checking my sights, resting my elbows on the parapet and taking careful, aimed shots. This had a steadying effect on me, and I began to feel much better. I began, too, to feel a kind of pity for my enemies, exposed in the open to this murderous fire, so that, as I aligned my sights on one of them and pressed the trigger with a slow, steady pressure, as I had been taught, I found myself praying that my bullet might put him out of action, but not maim him grievously for life." Unquote. Here's one on entering the newly liberated city of Santander, where incidentally I've spent a lot of time myself. Quote, "As we neared the center of the town, we found the road lined deep with civilians who waved to us, pelted us with flowers, and cheered as though they had gone mad. I noticed women and girls wearing their best clothes, pathetically shoddy though they were, their faces transported with joy, yet showing the signs of months of fear and famine that no makeup could conceal. Republican rule in Santander had been particularly savage. Hundreds of nationalist supporters were thrown to their death from the top of the cliffs near the lighthouse on Cabo Mayor. I've been to that lighthouse. I've seen the monument. I did not realize that's what it was a memorial for, because the historical memory laws forced the local government to take the caption off. It's just a monument of a cross with someone hanging off the bottom of it as if they were about to fall. I did not know what to make of this. There's a picture of it on the accompanying article to this blog. But yeah, it's there. Anyway, on a few occasions, Kemp describes meeting the people in the towns they win from the Reds, who are apparently overjoyed to see nationalist soldiers taking over the city. This doesn't fit with the standard good guy versus bad guy story very well at all, but it may have been true. It's also possible that non-combatants who were sympathetic with the nationalist side at the time later had decades to change their minds, or that people will be polite to whoever happens to be marching through their town with a lot of guns. As usual, I wasn't there. I don't want to just call him a liar, obviously. Maybe this truly did happen. Anyway, I have a couple of questions brought up by this sort of thing. Did Franco have a lot of popular support during the war? Was he popular during his years in power? Somehow, I doubt they were doing a lot of public opinion surveys during the dictatorship. Anyway, I'll look into it for a future article. In the meantime, I wonder what the generation of Kemp and Orwell would think about men living now, whose adventures mostly amount to the meaningless flickerings on the screen of some video game. Both Kemp and Orwell did basic military training as part of their schooling, and apparently thought nothing of risking their lives in a foreign conflict for a few pesetas a day. Orwell was 33 years old when he did so, Kemp just 21. An Orwell quote, "It is better to die violently and not too old." Maybe that was just the time they lived in. Growing up during World War I is bound to give you a certain perspective about violence and death that most people today wouldn't understand. Like I said earlier, Kemp was on a gap year before settling down to a boring job as a barrister in London. Here's a quote about his experience in one of the many battles. Our orders, Cancela explained, were to hold our positions at all costs. Rather than retreat, we must die where we stood. Remembering the open ground across which our ammunition supplies would have to reach us, I wondered if we should be able to achieve even that usefully. Here's another quote about the first time he's seriously wounded in the war. Quote, as I unwound the tape from a grenade and slung it across the clearing, I understood that at last I was face to face with death, that there was nothing I could do about it. With that realization, there came over me an extraordinary sense of freedom and a release from care. A few yards in front of me, I caught sight of the red and yellow colors of a nationalist flag, which had been carried by one of our pelotones. It was on the ground beneath the dead body of its bearer. Running forward, I realize now, of course, that this was the most puerile dramatics. I seized the flag and ran back with it, calling encouragement to my men. I waved it in a wide arc. Whether this nonsense had any moral effect, I am unable to say. A second or two later, there was a soft thud beside me, an anguished shout of warning from my runner, Cuidado, mi alférez, and a violent explosion. Unquote. He spent some time in the hospital after that one, comes back to the war. Here's how he explains his final moments as a part of the Spanish Civil War, a participant in the Spanish Civil War, when he's wounded by a grenade inside a dugout. Quote, I had started to explain my plan, using my hands for gestures, as one does when speaking Spanish, when a grenade burst in the opening beside me. I barely heard the explosion. I was conscious of it only as a roaring in my ears, a hammer blow on the left side of my face, and a sickening dizziness as I fell to the floor. My mouth seemed to fill with a sea of pebbles. As it fell open, the sea resolved into a deluge of blood, and the pebbles into fragments of my back teeth. Twice more the blood welled up into my mouth to pour in a widening pool across the floor. I watched, with a detached bewilderment, changing to near panic. Oh God, I prayed, don't let me die like this, in terror. I took a grip on myself, remembering how someone once said to me, you're never dead till you think you are. Cancela, on the bed, was unhurt. He provided a comic interlude by standing over me, exclaiming in tones of sincere and horrified concern, Are you hit, Peter? Tell me, are you hit? He pulled himself together. Faintly, through the singing in my ears, I heard his strong voice calling for stretcher bearers. Unquote. I'm just going to say it. Kemp's description of getting a grenade blast to the chin is a lot better than Orwell's description of getting a bullet in the neck. Like I said, this book just might be better than Homage to Catalonia. Eventually, Kemp recovered from his busted jaw. He had reconstructive surgery, and in photos, he looks fine. He looked fine. He came back to Spain after the war was finished to pick up his discharge, and like I said, got a private audience with Franco himself. He was a bit starstruck by that great man. Those are his words, not mine. Apparently they spent about a half hour together in which Franco did all the talking. After the Spanish Civil War, he had some World War II adventures as a member of the British Special Operations Executive. His missions took him to Albania, Poland, and occupied France. He was imprisoned by the Soviets and later went to Asia, where he spent some time running guns for the French in Laos. He was, in other words, an adventurer. Finally retiring from the army due to tuberculosis, he became a writer and insurance salesman. As a reporter, he went to Central and South America, Rhodesia, and the Belgian Congo, Hungary, etc. He wrote 3 books besides Mine Were of Trouble, all memoirs of his life and war experiences. I have not read them. He finally died in 1993 at age 80. He never became a barrister. So, as usual, doing all of this reading just creates more questions in my mind. One question that I don't think I'll be asking myself, though, is, could the Civil War have been avoided? Because all of this research has completely disabused me of the notion that there was any possibility of a happy ending to the Spanish Civil War, in which the good guys could have won and everybody could live peacefully ever after. The situation during the Republic itself was bad enough, with peasant revolts brutally squashed by the Guardia Civil, constant strikes, and members of the government calling for violent revolution. Some alternative tellings of the story even suggest that the Republic had completely lost control of the country before the national uprising, and that the army was simply stepping in to maintain order. They weren't staging a coup against the elected government. They were stepping in because the elected government had collapsed. In other words, these other theories say that the Civil War actually started before 1936, and it was the left who basically started it. I used to think that was a pretty ridiculous take, but more research gives it a little bit of credibility. I still don't know, and I'm not going to make any firm statements here, but situations like the 1934 revolution, in which the PSOE, current ruling party of Spain, incidentally, the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, we could call them, this PSOE organized a revolutionary general strike in order to take down the government, which was at that point being run by a different party. While this revolution was raging, especially in Asturias, coal mining territory in the north, the Catalans declared independence, sort of. They seem to do that from time to time. Recently, they sort of did it several years ago in 2017. In this case, back in 1934, it only lasted for a few hours, but the central government did have to declare an estado de guerra before it was all over. They declared an official state of war to get the Catalans back in line. So it doesn't exactly sound like peaceable times before the official civil war. The fact is, people on the left had been talking about civil war for some time before the thing actually started. Socialist Largo Caballero, nicknamed the Spanish Lenin, and later president of the Republic for a while, suggested that declaring civil war might be the left's only option in January 1936, months before the military coup. Hugh Thomas, author of the definitive history, The Spanish Civil War, which is currently on my bookshelf but not yet read, called the conflict the culmination of 100 years of class war. Taking that into account and knowing what I know, I don't think the Civil War was anybody's fault in particular. The Spanish situation was bad. The peasants and the working classes, of course, had some great points that they were making. And one way or another, there was going to be violence. There was actually plenty of violence happening before the war broke out. So I think that on balance, the whole thing was inevitable. It was going to happen with or without Franco and his general buddies staging their coup. In any case, Kemp is happy when Franco wins, Orwell seems to have thought that Spain would have been better off with Stalin. Knowing what we know about the situation of the Soviet Union during those years, this seems very doubtful. It could have been far worse if the Soviets had won. I don't know what Orwell knew about what was going on in the Soviet Union, but it does seem clear at this point that Stalin would not have done great things for any of the satellites. And if Spain had ended up as a Soviet satellite, who knows what would have happened. Things also could have been worse if Franco had been on friendlier terms with Hitler. As it is, Spain didn't join World War II. Hitler did not like Franco. But fascism still survived for decades after the war. Things turned out badly enough as they are. Several people in Kemp's book mention that it would have been better for foreigners to just stay out of the whole thing and let the Spaniards take care of their own problems. And they probably also had a point. According to Anthony Beevor and other sources, in 1936, the Spanish military didn't have enough ammunition for even a full day of actual war. Without the flood of foreign weapons, bombs, tanks, and planes, the whole thing might have been over pretty quickly. Or maybe it just would have ground on with strikes, political assassinations, and minor street fights for decades. Who knows? It's all speculation at this point. A little about the aftermath before we finish up today. Years ago, I heard someone on a podcast, I forget which one, say that the most significant event in the American Civil War is what happened after it was done. Everyone stopped killing each other. This is not, he went on to explain, what usually happens in civil wars. Most of the time, the winning side continues the persecution, killing and imprisoning the losers for years or sometimes decades afterwards. Continued killing and repression is exactly what happened in Spain post-1939. The World War II years and thereafter were no picnic, especially if you were known to be from a family that was on the left during the Civil War. Spanish people of the older generations, older than me at least, have told me that Spain is still divided between victors and vanquished. That which side your family was on makes a big difference in your life to this day. I don't know if younger people feel the same way. Maybe I'll ask some. Anyway, the post-war and transition to democracy is the topic of a future article. I've got Giles Tremlett's book, Ghosts of Spain, which seems to deal with that sort of thing, here on my shelf, waiting to be finished. For now, let's leave aside our bizarro world and our speculations. I have a little idea I like to call the history sucked hypothesis, which basically states that previous decades and centuries were dirty and dangerous, and we're lucky to be alive today. Full disclosure, I've spent plenty of time wishing I were around in the 60s in Greenwich Village or the 20s in Paris, but when you get into the gritty details of those periods, the poverty, the STDs, the lack of basic civil rights and indoor plumbing, etc., I figure we're better off here in the 21st century. Although I guess I could be proven wrong by future events. That's why it's just the history sucked hypothesis. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. I hope you've enjoyed reading this or gotten something interesting from it. I've spent the last 6 weeks of my life reading and rereading Civil War books and articles, and I'm aching to do something different. I guess I'll do Ghosts of Spain a bit later on. I might also do Hemingway. You can subscribe to my email updates on the blog, expatmadrid.com. You could subscribe to my podcast. It's on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and many other places. The podcast, you're listening to it, so it's called Spain to Go. You probably already knew that. You could go by YouTube and check out Learn Spanish with Daniel. I'll be putting up episodes of this podcast also on YouTube, but mostly what I've got there is Spanish videos, as the title suggests. I'm teaching a little bit of Spanish. You could donate some money. Hey, I would appreciate any amount that you want to send my way. You could go to expatmadrid.com/donate for that. Thanks a lot. I hope you're having a great day wherever you are in the world. Stay dry. Don't get any grenades in the chin or bullets in the neck. And I hope to speak to you soon. Hasta la próxima. Bye.